Carbon tax versus the premiers, a cross-country campaign by the Prime Minister, and possible Chinese election interference. There's so much to unpack this week in Canadian politics. And here to break it all down is Toronto Sun columnist Brian Lilley, who's joining me now from Toronto. Brian, welcome back. Great to have you on again.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's get right into this. Parliament is debating a Conservative motion today calling on the Prime Minister to meet with all the premiers on the issue of carbon tax. And in fact, 6 premiers, starting with Alberta's Danielle Smith, have written asking for a meeting. So, Brian, why won't Trudeau meet with them?
Because it's 2024. His answer actually was, we had a meeting in 2016. So our newspaper, we ran the headline, because it's not 2016. A play of it on his famous because it's 2015 line. It's a puzzling argument, because when they brought in the carbon tax, well, first off, they had a meeting with the premiers in March of 2016, where they agreed to a basic outline, but then they were supposed to go back, and each province was supposed to say, well, here's what we're doing to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So in Alberta, that was working with the oil and gas industry to reduce emissions at well sites, in terms of how much emissions a project was putting out as they were extracting the oil or the gas. In Saskatchewan, it was carbon capture and storage. And so each province was supposed to come back with that. And that was March 2016. They had an agreement. There would be no imposition of unilateral imposition of a carbon tax. The premiers did not want a consumer-based tax. And then in October 2016, middle of the environment ministers, provincial and federal and territorial environment ministers meeting in Montreal, the Trudeau government unilaterally announced a carbon tax. So you had the Liberal environment ministers of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador walk out. You had Scott Moe, who was not yet Premier of Saskatchewan, he was then their environment minister, walk out of the meeting. Everybody's fuming, except for Justin Trudeau's good pal, the former Ontario Wynne government. They loved it. But even Alberta Premier Rachel Notley criticized Trudeau at the time, saying, this isn't how we're supposed to do it. So, for him to turn around and say, well, we had a meeting in 2016. Yeah, but you lied in 2016. And it's 8 years later, and none of the people who were premier then are premier now. So not only do you have 6 premiers who have written letters, Jeanette, but you've also got Wab Kinew, New Democratic Party premier of Manitoba, who has said outright he just wants the carbon tax taken off in his province. He doesn't believe it's necessary, and he's got an argument for why he thinks that is. Every premier has an argument for why they think that is. Trudeau says, well, you should show up with a new plan, but he won't talk to them about their new plans. He won't listen to them about their new plans. And so they're asking for a meeting. What's ironic is I've got all these quotes and even a tweet that I reposted from Trudeau in 2015, saying, Prime Minister should meet with premiers. And he was denouncing Stephen Harper for not meeting with certain premiers and saying, as Prime Minister, I will do this. And now his answer for why he won't meet with them was, well, I met with your predecessors 8 years ago.
Wow. And then, Brian, it looks like even the Bloc Québécois is speaking out against this motion, even though carbon tax doesn't apply in Quebec. And in fact, Quebecers even pay lower on carbon. So how on earth does this even make sense then?
It really doesn't. I mean, they're debating a motion about a carbon tax that doesn't apply in Quebec, and the Bloc Québécois is still opposing it. Quebec has a cap and trade system, which is a carbon tax by another name, but it's not a direct on consumer carbon tax. We used to be part of that here in Ontario. Under the Wynne Liberals, Ontario joined Quebec and California in a carbon market. It didn't do anything except drive up costs, much like the carbon tax. But for whatever reason, Quebec is allowed to get away with what is effectively a lower price on carbon than the rest of us pay. And that's not from me. That's from an Alberta economist who's supportive of carbon taxes. While we're paying $80 a ton, they're paying $57 a ton, and the Bloc still gets to vote on raising the carbon tax, which they voted in favor of, raising the carbon tax on the rest of us on April 1st, but they're not paying that increase in Quebec, and now they're speaking out against Pierre Poilievre's motion. Makes no sense to me, but they are elected members of a federal legislature, so they get to vote on everything that's there.
And speaking of Pierre Poilievre, he made a surprise statement over the weekend saying he would be willing to vote in favor of the Liberal government's budget. There was a but and an if in his statement, though. So what were his conditions, Brian?
Yeah, I was a bit surprised when I heard that he was saying, "Oh, I'll vote for the Trudeau budget." Okay, what's the catch? There's got to be a catch here. And he had some key demands, including axing the tax. Now, he didn't call for the carbon tax to be axed completely, and he didn't even call for the price to be reversed. But he did say he wants the Trudeau government to allow Bill C 234 to pass. Now, this is a bill from it's a private member's bill from an Ontario Conservative MP named Ben Lobb. It passed the House of Commons already with the support of the Bloc and the NDP. It passed the Senate with some amendments, which means it was sent back to the House, and now it's just kind of languishing. This bill would reduce the remaining carbon tax for farmers. And the Liberals will tell you, oh, no, 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 we don't charge the carbon tax for farmers. Tell that to anyone who has to dry their grain. Tell that to anyone who has to heat a barn. If you're in northern Alberta and you've got a dairy herd, well, you're going to be heating the barn, at least partially, right? And you're paying the carbon tax on that. If you are growing corn, soy, barley, all these things that need to be dried, you're going to be paying the carbon tax on either the natural gas or the propane. And that's what they're trying to remove. And the Liberals have been fighting it tooth and nail. In fact, they tried to get it killed in the Senate, but the Senate passed it. So that was one of the big requests. The other was getting out of the way of building housing. Poilievre says with all these announcements Trudeau's making, what he's really building is a bureaucracy instead of housing. And he said, get out of the way, follow our plan on housing, and get houses built instead of bureaucracy. And the third thing that he said was bring in a dollar for dollar spending cap. And that means, great, you can spend more money on a new project over here, but you've got to find $1 in savings for every dollar in new spending. That's been done before by Liberal and Conservative governments, and it works out very well in terms of moving from low priorities to high priorities. But Trudeau's not doing that.
Okay, well, Brian, the Prime Minister is scheduled to appear at the Foreign Interference Commission on Wednesday. So what do you expect to hear from him, and what have we learned already?
I think we're going to hear a lot of evasive answers. I don't think he's going to be forthcoming at all. I think he's going to try and explain away, um, what he knew and when he knew it, because those are the big questions for him, right? When did you know that China was actively trying to interfere in our elections, and what did you do about it? Did you try and stop it? What we've learned so far is that the prime minister was informed of several plots, including, you'll remember the one that made the news headlines well over a year ago now, where there was talk of more than $250,000 from the People's Republic of China, the dictators in Beijing, being funneled through Canadian channels to 11 different candidates, 7 Liberal, 4 Conservatives in the Greater Toronto area. This was the 2019 election. This was one of the ways that they tried to interfere. We know that Trudeau was briefed on that, and yet he has tried to claim that he wasn't briefed on any of these things. He's tried to claim that he didn't know, that this was, that nothing actually happened. Well, I think the inquiry, which he fought tooth and nail against calling, is showing that he did know. So, we'll hear more from his chief of staff, Katie Telford. We'll hear from him, and we'll start to get a better sense of what they were doing. I think what this inquiry is going to show is that there was sufficient information that China was trying to interfere, but that the Trudeau Liberals and the federal apparatus just decided not to do it. On the political side, I think it's because the Liberals knew that it was benefiting them and hurting the Conservatives. On the bureaucratic side, I don't think they took the threat seriously enough.
Okay, so Brian, but meanwhile, we have former Conservative leader Aaron O'Toole saying last week that he believes foreign interference by China cost his party as many as 9 seats in the 2021 election. And then we have the Prime Minister saying that not a single riding was impacted by foreign interference and the election was fair and free. But Meanwhile, isn't the inquiry into this still ongoing? So is it premature for Trudeau to say this?
It's a bit like a politician saying, I think the guy on trial for murder is innocent, or I think he did it. Politicians don't proclaim on judicial proceedings. And this isn't a court proceeding, but it is a quasi judicial body. And we've got the prime minister declaring, nothing to see here, nothing happened, don't worry about it. That's really disconcerting. I called him out on it in a couple of columns last week when he started doing this. The Globe and Mail ran an editorial saying, please, Mr. Prime Minister, let the inquiry do its work. He is proclaiming an outcome in an inquiry that he called with a judge that he appointed before the work is done. Aaron O'Toole gave his testimony, and Justin Trudeau's response is, well, he's just trying to find an excuse for his bad campaign. Um, I'm sorry, no, that's not the answer. Trudeau was asked several times about specifics last week. Information that came out at the inquiry, he was asked, did you know about this? What did you do? Who informed you? And he kept saying, I will speak at the inquiry. I will give my testimony at the inquiry. But on this issue of did it affect the outcome, he was willing to speak freely and offer an opinion that, quite frankly, he should be keeping to himself, given his position as prime minister and the man that appointed and started all of this.
Yeah, certainly. Okay, so Brian, last week during one of his many news conferences, Trudeau said immigration has made the housing crisis worse. He even said that in some areas, the high immigration numbers are driving down wages. Now, were you surprised to hear him say this?
Absolutely, I was, because just a little while ago, Justin Trudeau would have declared anyone who said such things to be anti-immigrant, to be a racist, to be xenophobic, un-Canadian. And now he's saying it. Look, the spike in immigration, especially uh, people who are not permanent residents, meaning temporary foreign workers, but really international students, has had a huge impact on housing. But I would also argue that, we're bringing in 500,000 roughly new permanent residents every year. Trudeau's words were that we're bringing in people faster than we can absorb them. Jeanette, in the last 9 months, we brought in more than 1 million people in the middle of a housing crisis. So we don't have enough homes for the people who are here already. It's driving up costs. And this has gone from just being a problem in Toronto and Vancouver to being a problem everywhere. You're seeing the effects in Alberta with prices rising, maybe not as fast, but they are going up. We're seeing, increased strain on our healthcare system. Stats Canada, just on Friday, came out with a jobs report that showed the unemployment rate had gone up from 5.1% a year ago to 6.1% this year. And what did Stats Canada say? We are bringing in people faster than we're creating jobs. That over the last year, we created 324,000 jobs, but brought in more than 1 million working age people. So that's just 1 million working age people, meaning 15 and older. Think of all the people that come with their newborns, their toddlers, their young children. Those kids aren't counted in that. These are 1 million workers were added, and we created 324,000 jobs. It's having an impact on all sectors of the economy. And Trudeau acts like, well, we've got to find out who's behind all this. Well, it's you. You're the prime minister. You're in charge. Do something about this. But he says they're going to keep the current number of permanent residents coming in every year where it is at 500,000. I still think that's a bit too high. It's not being anti-immigrant to say that we're bringing in too many people if we have all these problems and we can't house people. It's looking at reality. But on the international student and temporary foreign worker side, he said that temporary immigrant population went from 2% of the country's population in 2017 to 7.5% last year. He says over the coming years, plural, he wants to decrease that to 5%. So, okay, we're going to take 2, 3, 4 years to dial back the number of people we're bringing in on a temporary basis. That's not going to solve the problem. He's had all these housing announcements. The number one thing he could do to help deal with the housing situation is deal with immigration in a serious way, but he's not doing it.
Wow. We're out of time here, but Toronto Sun columnist Brian Lilley, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.